Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks. Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, Bachelor's Degree Program, Elective Course, Gender Studies, BGSE-001 Gender Sensitization, Society, Culture and Change, Block 6 Gender Representation and Media Unit 20 Conclusion, Towards Gender Equality. 20.1 Introduction. The Global Gender Gap Report 2015 measures gender equality in economic, education, health, and political spheres in 145 countries, including India. The 2015 report notes that gender gaps are highest in the economic sphere, followed by the political, and least with regard to health and education spheres. While there has been progress on reducing gender gaps since 2006 in all four spheres, the progress has been slow in economic sphere and better with respect to the others. In 2015, India ranked 108 out of 145 in terms of gender gap, with countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka scoring better than India in the South Asian region. If one looks at trends across time, India has made progress in reducing gender gaps in education and health, but gaps have increased in economic and political spheres between 2006 and 2015. Thus, achieving gender equality is a challenge globally and nationally. But first, there is a need to understand the concept of gender equality, global and Indian scenario on gender equality, and the strategies to promote gender equality. C. Fig. 20.1 for the objective of the unit. 20.2 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to times explain what is gender equality, times analyze how unequal women are, and times describe strategies to promote gender equality. A section would be devoted to each of the three objectives, with interactive exercises at the end of each section to help the student apply the session in their contexts. 20.3 Understanding Gender Equality. In this section, we will explain the concept gender equality through stories, facts, and examples. 20th March 2001 Thirsty Fox and Crane. Let us begin with a story. Once there was a thirsty fox and a thirsty crane. A saucer of water each is placed before them, see Fig. 20.2 Who will be able to drink the water, fox or crane or both? Why? Fig. 20.2 Thirsty fox and thirsty crane. Only the fox can drink the water placed in a saucer, as it has a tongue and not a long beak. The crane has a long beak and needs a beaker or a tall drinking container to drink water. A few examples of women girls voicing that they have felt like the crane in the story are given in Fig. 20.3 Please identify the source of inequality it reflects: gender, caste, religion, disability, etc. Match column 1 to column 2 with a line. Fig. 20.3 Inequality Exercise. 20th March 2002 Understanding Gender Equality. Drawing lessons from the story on the fox and crane and examples of inequality in Fig. 23. There are two concepts of equality: formal equality and substantive equality. Times formal equality. The concept of formal gender equality is premised on the principle of sameness of women and men and girls and boys, and assumes that if women, girls, and men, boys receive the same opportunity and are treated similarly, using male standards, equality will be achieved. It does not take into account the ways in which women are different from men, socially, and a few biological differences, and how they are disadvantaged because of these differences. The formal equality approach is similar to placing a saucer each before the thirsty fox, men boys, and thirsty crane, women girls. Times substantive equality. The concept of substantive equality recognizes that women and men have to be treated differently, and their disadvantages to begin with have to be addressed to achieve equality. The substantive equality approach entails placing a saucer before the thirsty fox, men boys, and beaker before the thirsty crane, women girls. The substantive equality approach also recognizes that gender interlocks with other identities like caste, class, race, ethnicity, religion, ability, and age to keep women girls in unequal positions. Going back to figure 20.3, substantive equality approach would entail strengthening child care facilities in panchayats, passing a policy that permits women to dress according to their culture, automatic transfer of scholarships to bank accounts, and compulsory ramps in all government schools, and permitting girls with disability to wear dresses they desire. Let us read about gender inequality at global and Indian scenario on gender inequality. 20.4 Global and Indian Scenario on Gender Inequality. In this section, we will look into the gender equality in health, education, and economy through facts. Let us start looking into gender gap in health first. 20th April 2001 Gender gap in health. Table 20.1 presents global, 145 countries, and Indian statistics on gender gap in health. Trends between 2006 and 2015 are also given. The Global Gender Gap Report provides an overview of the differences between women's and men's health through the use of two indicators. The first is the sex ratio at birth, which aims specifically to capture the phenomenon of missing women prevalent in many countries with a strong son preference. Second, the report uses the gap between women's and men's healthy life expectancy. Healthy life expectancy provides an estimate of the number of years that women and men can expect to live in good health by taking into account the years lost to violence, disease, malnutrition, or other relevant factors. The Global Gender Gap Report gives more weight or importance to sex ratio at birth and lesser to female to male healthy life expectancy. The global gender gap measures with respect to health could be strengthened by adding measures such as times male over female contraception and times gender-based violence against women. Table 20.1 Gender Gaps in Health, Global and Indian Picture. On a scale of 0 to 1 implying equality, the global gender gap in health is little, standing at 0.957 globally and 0.952 in India in 2015. If one takes into account trends over time, gender gap in health has increased between 2006 and 2015, with the increase being sharper globally than in India. See Table 20.1. The main reason is the decline in sex ratio at birth globally and in India, which reflects the combination of spreading son preference in countries like China, India, Republic of Korea, Vietnam, Nepal, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and the fact that female fetuses are more vulnerable to miscarriages than males. In India too, sex ratio at birth has declined. On the other hand, the ratio of healthy female to male life expectancy of women to men has improved during the same period. An aspect that is worth investigating is whether this ratio has improved because women are healthier or because men have become more unhealthy due to smoking, alcohol consumption, and stress. Some of the supply side, i.e., health provision, barriers to gender equality in health include distances to health facilities, inadequate female doctors, lack of privacy, poor facilities like separate toilets and water, introduction of charges for some services and medicines, inadequate emergency obstetric services and reproductive cancer screening services, and discrimination against women and girls with HIV, disability, scheduled castes, tribes, poor and minorities in health facilities. The demand side, i.e., family, community or market level, Barriers to gender equality in health include greater workload of women than men, health complications due to violence against women, restrictions on women's mobility, lesser willingness of families to invest in women's health when compared to that of men, private insurance services which do not cover maternal health, and community norms prescribing harmful health practices like female genital mutilation. Thus, placing the same saucer of health services or health education is not enough. These differences have to be taken into account. 20th April 2002 Gender Gap in Education Attainment. The gap between women and men's current access to education is captured by the Global Gender Gap Report through ratios of women to men in primary, secondary, and tertiary level education, and the ratio of the female literacy rate to the male literacy rate, where the focus is on outcomes. Gender equality in enrollment in primary education receives the most weightage or importance, and enrollment in tertiary education the least, with the weight given to the rest falling in between. See Table 20.2. This measure of gender gap in education could be strengthened through adding gender gaps in access to early childhood development and actual abilities in mother tongue, English, mathematics, science, etc., at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. The data from the Global Gender Gap Reports, 2010 and 2015, see Table 20.2, indicates progress in reducing the gender gap in education globally and in India between 2006 and 2015, with greater progress being made by India than the global average. Disaggregating further, progress has been higher in bridging gender gaps in tertiary education globally, but on the other three, literacy, enrollment in primary and secondary education, gender gaps seem to have widened globally. This could be due to enhanced vulnerability of young girls during conflicts, which have been increasing, hence not sending them to school. You are listening to this book on Audio Learn IGNOU. On the other hand, in India, gender gaps with regard to all four indicators have reduced, with maximum reduction on tertiary education and least with regard to primary enrollment, wherein gaps were little to begin with. However, equality is still not achieved, especially with regard to literacy in India and enrollment in secondary education globally. Table 20.2 Gender Gaps in Education Global and Indian Picture. Look at the screen for table content. Some of the supply side, i.e., education provision, barriers to gender equality in education include lack of safe transport for girls, female teachers, separate female toilets with water, code against sexual harassment in schools and colleges, adequate girls' hostels for studying, and discrimination against girls with disability, scheduled castes, tribes, and minorities in education institutions. The demand-side barriers to gender equality in education include preference for sons' education over girls', especially when family resources are scarce, domestic workload of girls, restrictions on girls' mobility after puberty, employment availability for girls, e.g. as domestic helps, an increase in dowry with greater girls' education. Thus, placing the same saucer of education services is not enough, but these differences have to be taken into account. 20th April 2003 Gender Gap in Economic Sphere. This gender gap in economic sphere measures three aspects: times the participation gap, times the remuneration gap, and the economic advancement gap. The participation gap is captured using the difference between women and men in labor force participation rates. See glossary. The remuneration gap is captured through a hard data indicator, ratio of estimated female to male earned income, and the qualitative data, wage equality for similar work. Finally, the gap between the advancement of women and men is captured through data on the ratio of women to men among legislators, senior officials, and managers, and the ratio of women to men among technical, e.g., welders, and professional workers, e.g., doctors. Maximum weightage is given the ratio of women to men in technical and professional work, and least weight is given for wage equality for similar work. Table 20.3 Gender Gaps in Economic Sphere Global and Indian Picture. Look at the screen for table content. Data presented in Table 20.3 reveals that gender gap in economic sphere has increased globally and in India, with the increase being more prominent in India. Disaggregating further, globally the gap has widened on 4 out of 5 indicators, barring estimated year income, which has gone up slightly between 2006 and 2015. Gender gap has widened most with regard to proportion of women in professional and technical work. This could be due to the global recession and the tendency of employers to retrench women employees than men employees due to added expenses on child care and maternity leave. Data is not available with respect to India. Onto indicators for 2015, gender gap with respect to professional and technical workers, and gender gap with regard to legislators, senior officials, and managers. Gender gap in labor force participation, wage equality for similar work, and estimated earned income has widened between 2006 and 2016, with the gap on estimated earned income being widest. One reason could be that the country has seen an increase in economic growth, and men who were poor earlier now feel that it reflects on their prestige if their wives do not work just like women from upper caste and well-off backgrounds. Mechanization of agriculture has also led to lesser demand for women for transplanting and harvesting. While men migrate, rural women rarely own land and hence are not able to access institutional credit to cultivate land. Bulk of the women labor force in India is in agriculture, but this is the sector growing the least. Some of the supply side, informal sector employers, government and companies, factors which hamper gender equality in the economic sphere in India is the lower valuation of the work that women do, lack of child care facilities in workplace, lack of clean public toilets, informal sector, the modeling of work around timings suitable to men, lack of flexible timings and workspace, gender stereotyping in work allocation, unequal access to training programs, the preference of men in promotions, the lack of quotas of women at all level in private sector. There is a quota that a minimum of one woman in the governing board of private companies, which is not adequate, unsafe transport, and sexual harassment at workspace, and lack of awareness of guidelines on the same. You are listening to this book on audio learn IGNOU. On the demand side, some of the barriers include the perception that caring for the family is the primary role of women. Related to that is the lack of acceptance of house husbands, the perception that women should not live separately in case of transfer linked with promotions, norms against women traveling and living alone with regard to work, social norms against women coming late from work, some women not having control over earnings and women having lesser assets and resources to start their own business. 20th April 2004 Gender Gap in Political Sphere. Gender gap in political sphere captures the ratio of women to men in minister-level positions and the ratio of women to men in parliamentary positions. In addition, includes the ratio of women to men in terms of years in executive office, prime minister or president, in the last 50 years. A drawback in this measure is the absence of any indicators capturing differences between the participation of women and men at local levels of government, which is likely to be higher for India than the global average, with 50% reservation of women in rural local bodies, Panchayati Raj, and 33% in Nagarpalikas, urban local bodies. Table 20.4 provides data on gender inequality in political sphere globally and in India in 2006 and 2015. A positive trend is that gender gap in this sphere has reduced globally and in India, with the reduction in gender gap being more prominent in India than the global average. Disaggregating further, gender gaps have reduced with regard to all three indicators in the political sphere globally and in India: women in parliament, women in ministerial posts, and years with female heads of state. Gender gap has reduced most with respect to ratio of women in ministerial positions in India. Globally, the reduction in gender gap has reduced most with regard to years with female heads of state in 50 years. Concerted advocacy by women's groups on representation of women in political leadership has played a role in reducing gender gap in political sphere globally and in India. However, advocacy efforts by Indian women's groups on reservation for women in parliament are yet to succeed. A bill has been passed by Rajya Sabha, upper house of parliament, to amend the Constitution of India and reserve 33% of seats in Lok Sabha, lower house of parliament, and state assemblies for women, but is yet to be passed by Lok Sabha. The main reason for the stalemate is the resistance from male politicians and concerns on how it would affect reservation on the basis of caste. While the gender gap in political sphere has been reducing in India, it is higher than gender gap in health and education, but better than economic sphere. The gender gap in political sphere is 0.433 on a scale of 0 to 1, is however lower than the figure at the global level of 0.230 in 2015. If the indicator of gender gap in women's participation in local government is added, India would perform better. Table 20.4 Gender Gaps in Political Sphere Global and Indian Picture. Look at the screen for table content. The political system side barriers to women's political participation include lack of quota at parliament level, corruption associated with politics, biases and harassment, gender, caste, and others. In political system, women being made to enter politics as proxies for their husbands, elected women being given lesser infrastructure and budget than elected men, allocation of soft portfolios to women, and lack of child care and other facilities in political institutions. Households and communities perceive that politics is the domain of men. Most women do not have financial resources to contest elections, and rarely is credit available for expenses. Men rarely come forward to support child care, while their spouses are engaged in political decision making. Poor mobility and lower levels of female literacy are also constraints. 20.5 Gender-based violence. According to European Institute of Gender Equality, gender-based violence against women shall mean violence that is directed against a woman because she is a woman, or 2. that affects women disproportionately. One can extend this to girls as well. Gender-based violence is not taken into account separately in the Global Gender Gap Index, and data on this issue is not systematically gathered globally. UN Women 2012 estimates that 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner like husband or boyfriend, or by a non-intimate partner at some point in their lives. However, some national studies show that up to 70% of women have experienced physical and/or sexual violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. It further observes that women who have been physically or sexually abused by their partners are more than twice as likely to have an abortion, almost twice as likely to experience depression, and in some regions, 1.5 times more likely to acquire HIV, as compared to women who have not experienced partner violence. As per the National Family Health Survey 3, 2005 to 6, 40% of married Indian women in the age group of 15 to 49 years faced physical, sexual or emotional violence from their spouses, husbands, during their married life. See figure 20.5. Most spousal violence begins in the first 5 years of marriage. While 37% of men were physically violent against their wives, only 1% of wives reported being physically violent against their husbands. 10%, 10% of women reported being subject to sexual violence by spouses and 16% to emotional violence. The NFHS 3 observes that spousal violence against women increases with age, number of children, alcohol consumption of husband, and history of spousal violence in husband's family. It decreases with economic status of household and education of women. Reported spousal violence was highest in Bihar and least in Himachal Pradesh. Spousal violence led to injuries and health problems. Only 1 if 4 abused women sought help, and mainly from family members. More recent data from National Family Health Survey 4 is yet to come. Fig. 20.5 Look at the screen for table content. Sex selection, incest, girl-child marriage, forced marriage of girls, dowry harassment, etc. are other forms of gender-based violence within family on which hard data is not available. Similarly, there is little comprehensive data on violence against women and girls in public sphere. In 2012, a study conducted in New Delhi found that 92% of women reported having experienced some form of sexual violence in public spaces in their lifetime, and 88% of women reported having experienced some form of verbal sexual harassment, including unwelcome comments of a sexual nature, whistling, leering, or making obscene gestures, in their lifetime. Acid violence on women is not uncommon, in particular by men who have been rejected by a girl. Cybercrimes against women are increasing with spread of technology. Trafficking of girls is not an uncommon, and at times even women are abducted and trafficked. Gender and other identities interlock when violence is unleashed on women and men marrying outside their caste, religion, nationality, and of other abilities. Some of the social reasons for violence against Indian women and girls are the patriarchal mindset in society, the social norm of viewing girls as fathers or husbands' property, viewing girls as holders of community prestige, portrayal of violence against women in media, weak economic and political standing of women, and very little presence of informal pro-women mediation mechanisms. At the service provision level, there are delays involved in writing first-hand information reports, FIR. Police and judiciary are not always gender and socially sensitive. There are inadequate gender-sensitive people in judiciary. There are delays in giving verdicts. Verdicts are not always progressive, and the entire process is expensive and takes time, which poor women cannot afford. Box No. 20.1. To sum up, gender gaps are high in India in economic and political sphere, and Indian women and girls face a significant degree of gender-based violence within and outside the family. While gender gaps are less in the area of health and education, gender equality has not been achieved. In the health, education, and economic spheres, India lags behind the global average, and the situation is reversed with regard to political. If one examines trends, India has reduced gender gaps on health, education, and political sphere, but gender gaps in the economic realm have increased. There is not concrete day-to-day evidence to comment on trends with regard to gender-based violence. Look at the screen for table content. Check your progress. 1. Activity. Female students. Write your story, her story. 1. Were there any gender gaps you faced when compared to your brothers, male cousins, male friends, or male classmates? Why? How did you respond? 2. Think back. Did your caste, religion, economic background, or other identities also have a role to play in leading to the gender gaps? If yes, how? How did you respond? Male students. 1. Was there any gender gaps your sisters, female cousins, female friends or classmates faced? Why? How did you respond? How did she respond? 2. Do you feel any pressure on you because you are a male youth, which you do not think a female youth would experience? What are they? How do you deal with them? 2. What is formal and substantive equality? 3. Write short notes on women political participation in panchayats. In the following section, you will read about measures taken towards bringing about substantive gender equality. 20.6 Towards substantive gender equality. In this section, we will discuss about the efforts at international level to bring gender equality. 20th June 2001 International Conventions and Agreements. The four important international and agreements towards substantive gender equality that are relevant now are given in the figure 20.6. There is a difference between the two types of international instruments. Times Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, 1981, and the Vienna Declaration, 1993. Times the Beijing Platform for Action, BPFA, 1994, and Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, 2015. The first two are legally binding on the countries which have ratified it, while the last two are not. The country reports submitted by the government on the CEDAW, for example, are reviewed by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This committee also receives shadow or alternative reports from NGOs and compares the government reports with the NGO reports and other literature and gives its concluding observations. In the next report, the governments have to report on progress in implementing recommendations listed in the concluding observations. Through a similar process, the implementation of Vienna Declaration, 1993 is monitored by the United Nations Human Rights Council. While the governments do submit reports on Beijing Platform for Action and will have to do so on SDGs, the system of shadow reports is not insisted upon and varies from country to country. If one examines the differences in priorities over time as well as how far these conventions and agreements focus attention to address gender gaps raised highlighted in previous section, one can see that over the years progress has been made in two areas. Placing reducing unpaid care and sharing of household work as one of targets and emphasis on equal access to technologies. However, attention to issues of diversity amongst women was perhaps stronger in CEDAW and BPFA Thanthe Goal 5 of SDGs. Further, sensitization of men and boys on gender and social equality has not received priority. Comparable data is not available globally and nationally on some of the issues like women's asset ownership and incidents of violence against women. Nevertheless, these instruments and agreements are useful to know and use strategically to negotiate gender equality vis-a-vis state, workplace, community, family and marriage. Fig. 20.6 Important Conventions and Agreements Related to Gender Equality. Look at the screen for table content. There are many more agreements on gender equality from the year 1975, which was the International Year of Women, and the decades of women's development that follow. Let us now read about the efforts made at national level. 20.7 Indian government's approaches, legislation, policies and schemes. Let us look into Government of India approaches, legislation, policies and schemes. 20th July 2001 approaches. Historically, Indian government legislation, policies, and schemes have followed different approaches. In the 1960s-1970s, the welfare approach was popular amongst government. This approach gave importance to women's role as mothers and caregivers. The maternal and child health programs are one example. The focus was mainly on the reproductive roles of women. In 1974, the report Toward Equality drafted by Committee on the Status of Women in India heralded the shift towards an equality approach. The report called for promoting equality in all spheres, economic, political, and social. The Equal Remuneration Act, 1976, is an example of an offshoot of this approach. The 1980s saw a shift to women's poverty reduction. Schemes such as the development of women and children in rural areas started in 1982 to 1983, with focus on group building, savings, credit, and income generation amongst women. The National Commission on Self-Employed Women and Women in the Informal Sector published the report Shramshakti in 1989 to highlight the plight of poor women in this sector. In the 1990s, there was a move towards efficiency approach. That approach uses women's skills as resource for other goals like using women's nimble fingers towards sericulture development and for seed hybridization. It is from late 1990s onwards the empowerment approach is emerging, reflected in the Mahila Samakhya Program, 1989, National Policy on Empowerment of Women, 2001, and the National Mission on Empowerment of Women, 2010. A second study on status of women in India has submitted a preliminary report to the government. As depicted by the Fig. 20.7 laws, policies and schemes related to 4 of the 5 approaches, other than efficiency, are central to substantive equality. For example, child care support, welfare, money in one's hands, poverty approach, 33 to 50% reservation in local government, formal equality, and realization of one's potential and roles of oneself in local government, empowerment, are key to substantive equality gap in political sphere. Fig. 20.7 Towards substantive equality. Look at the screen for table content. 20th July 2002 Policies, Legislation and Schemes. Listed in Table 20.5 is a list of important legislations, policies, and schemes to address different spheres of gender inequality. Please try and match which legislation, policy, or scheme addresses what sphere of inequality. You may find that some legislation, policy, or scheme has a bearing on several spheres. For example, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, one of the objectives of which is to eliminate open defecation, may not only improve health and safety of women, harassment of women when they go to toilets in the night is not uncommon. It may also enhance school attendance of girls as well as women's involvement in markets and panchayats and municipalities. Thus, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan may indirectly contribute to gender equality in health, economic and political. Table 20.5 Law, Policies and Schemes and Spheres of Influence. Look at the screen for table content. 20.8 Challenges in moving towards gender equality in India. In spite of these legislations, policies and schemes, gender gaps in economic, political, health and education persist in India. What do you think are the challenges at family marriage, community, religious institutions, media, private sector and government levels? Put it in the appropriate circle in Fig. 20.8. Fig. 20.8 Challenges towards gender equality. Look at the screen for table content. Challenges towards gender equality emerge from the interlocking of all identities in different institutions of society. The Indian government's approaches, laws, policies, and schemes seek to change some of the norms governing these institutions and identities, but not all. For example, the Hindu Succession Amendment Act 2005 gives equal inheritance rights to women, but there are not too many schemes for building assets of women from landless household or helping women in urban areas move from graduation to employment. 20.9 Summing UP. Formal equality is not enough for achieving equality in outcomes. Substantive equality is essential. The concept of substantive gender equality recognizes that women and men have to be treated differently and that women's disadvantages, in particular marginalized, to begin with have to be addressed to achieve equality. The gender gaps globally and in India are higher in economic and political sphere than education and health. Skewed sex ratio at birth is becoming a global and Indian concern, as well as high incidence of gender-based violence against women. The four important international conventions and agreements towards substantive gender equality are the CEDAW, 1979, Vienna Declaration, 1993, that violence against women is a human rights violation, Beijing Platform for Women, 1995, and Goal 5 of Sustainable Development Goals, 2015. National approaches towards gender equality are many and include a combination of welfare, formal gender equality, women's poverty reduction, efficiency, and empowerment. These international and national initiatives together can lead to substantive equality of women, provided they are backed by funds, human resources, gender transformative services, films and media, and gender transformative norms at community and family levels. You are listening to this audiobook on Audio Learn IGNOU. 20.10 Keywords. Labor force participation rate is the proportion of the population ages 15 and older that is economically active, all people who supply labor for the production of goods and services during a specified period. UN Women. UN Women is United Nations, UN, organization dedicated to gender equality and women empowerment. www.unwomen.org. Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the Global Goals, build on the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. The MDG had 8 anti-poverty targets that the world committed to achieving by 2015. The MDGs, adopted in 2000, aimed at an array of issues that included slashing poverty, hunger, disease, gender inequality, and access to water and sanitation. The new SDGs is broader than MDGs. It addresses the root causes of poverty and the universal need for development that works for all people. UNDP Administrator Helen Clark noted, "This agreement marks an important milestone in putting our world on an inclusive and sustainable course. If we all work together, we have a chance of meeting citizens' aspirations for peace, prosperity, and well-being, and to preserve our planet." Beijing Platform for Action. United Nations organized 4 international women conferences at Mexico, Nairobi, Copenhagen, and Beijing to address women issues and bring consensus among all countries to make necessary legislation and policies. The Beijing Platform for Action is the 4th International Women's Conference organized in Beijing in the year 1994. 20.1 to Unit N questions. 1. Explain gender gap in health using Fox and Crane stories. 2. Analyze gender gap in education. 3. Briefly explain government approaches, policies, and schemes for gender equality.
Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.